Okay, we're in this series, Ron. Welcome back to Connection Point Studies, by the way. And we're in this series called Sweet Lies We Tell Ourselves. Oh, Fudge, Sweet Lies We Tell Ourselves. What's the lie this week that we're talking about?
Yeah, the lie this week is God is too good to create hell.
Really? Wow. God is just too good. And that's interesting because we have to think about that as a part of that. Now, we got a warm-up question for them to think about in this whole process. Let's get them going on this question. This is a question that everybody in your group needs to answer.
Okay, the question is, tell us about a time in your life when you felt something was unfair. And secondly, do you think that God is always fair?
I can't wait to find out how you think about that. All right, take a little bit of time and share in your group on that, and then come back and read Matthew and chapter 24 and 25. Both those chapters, read it together before you come back. All right, Ron, I want to know how you answer that question. Is God always fair?
You know, my dad used to always say, life is not fair.
Life's not fair. You think God is?
I guess it depends what you mean by fair.
I think when we get to heaven, we're going to all look at this and say, he was really fair.
Yeah.
But from our eyes at this point, we can look at things and say, it doesn't always seem fair, does it?
We don't have enough information to know.
We don't. We don't know that at that point. So we've had them read into Matthew 24 and 25. So let's kind of set the scene for this and then dig into these questions.
Yeah, in fact, what I love about this passage is it gives us a good way to answer this sweet little lie. Because I just want to know, what is Jesus going to answer when the disciples ask a question that would lead down this path? So the disciples have asked a question, and Jesus gives this really long answer. What was the question?
All right. Hopefully they had a chance to dig in and go all the way back and figure out what the question was. What was the question?
It was found in Matthew 24:3. The disciples say, tell us, when will these things happen? And what is the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, what led up to that question was they were walking into Jerusalem, and these guys were country bumpkins, man. They were from Galilee. They come and see this amazing temple. It's just unbelievable to them. And they're saying, whoa, look at the stones, look at all this. And Jesus says, not one stone will be left on another.
Wow. And that shook him to the core, which he had already been shaking him to the core, because this happens to be at the end of his life. He's in the last week of his life, right? Matthew 24 happened in the middle of the last week of his life, where he's told them, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to die, I have all this. So they're saying, when's all this going to happen? And I can kind of sense that they are a little mixed up in everything, but Jesus really kind of clarifies some stuff here.
Yeah. So, in fact, the next thing we want to do is look at this answer, and it really consists of 3 parts. In Matthew 25, there's 2 parables, which are just stories, and then there's a description of what is actually going to happen when he returns. So, when we think about these stories, what did these stories, how do they compare to what we find in the actual events that Jesus describes?
Take a minute, answer those questions. That may take you a little bit of time because you're going to have to study a little bit. Okay, so let's help them answer that question. Let's think about that. How does that compare, and how did that?
Well, so at the beginning of each of the stories, he says, the kingdom of heaven will be like. Right? Or in verse 31, he says, when the Son of Man comes. So what we see is that these first 2 are stories that give us a parallel, a picture of what the kingdom of heaven is like. And then the third one, he says, this is what's going to actually happen.
Wow. And the kingdom of heaven is described, he's been describing it all along, but he really paints a really beautiful picture here, an interesting picture. Some make it and some don't, right? There's some ready and some aren't. And
yeah, in fact, that's what we want to do next. As we look at the parallels in these stories, we see groups of characters. And so there's some groups in the parables, and there's some groups in Jesus' return. And so what do these groups have in common? So let's look at that.
Okay, I kind of gave the answer away ahead of time, didn't I?
That's okay.
Some make it, some don't. One's left behind, the other one's taken. You know, there's a definite sense that some are ready and some aren't, right?
Well, we also see in each of the three, there's a ruler. There's in the first story, there's a bridegroom. In the second story, there's a master. And then, of course, Jesus is portrayed as the king in the third. We see groups of faithful people, like the wise virgins.
Right.
We see the faithful servants or the righteous ones at the end. We see unfaithful people who are the foolish virgins and the lazy servants.
And they don't make it.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing we want to look at, really, is what is the storyline? So each of these stories has a similar storyline, and the return of Jesus also has these elements.
Same storyline.
Yeah, as you think about the storyline, what do we see these things have in common?
I keep giving the answer to these questions ahead of time. So they say the storyline is some make it and some don't, right? Is that a part of it? Or it's even more than that.
It's even more than that. So first of
all,
all,
they're waiting, right? There's this time where there's
well, first of all, there's this undeserved gift given. Like there's a wedding party, right? You don't deserve anything. Right? You're just invited, right? There are talents given to these servants, right? And then there's a life given to people. And so this is like a responsibility you have. It's just given to you. It's a responsibility. And so in the terms of the responsibility, the virgins had to have oil for their lamps.
Right.
The servants had to have invested talents, and the righteous ones had to be caring for others. Then there's this second moment in each of the stories. It's the moment I call the reckoning, right? So in the wedding feast, those who are ready went in. When the bridegroom shows up, there's a moment. It's not 10 moments, not 100 moments. There's one. And those who are ready went in. There's in the servants, there's the master settles accounts.
Right. There's this reckoning.
There's this moment. He comes. It's time to settle the accounts. It's not like there's going to be 3 of those. There's only one. And then in verse 32, the nations will be gathered before him, the king. Right. So this moment of reckoning. And then the other thing I saw was that there's a reward or punishment. And so we see to the groups of the foolish virgins, he says, I don't know you. We see to the lazy servants, take the talent from him and throw him into outer darkness. And the king says to the unrighteous, depart from me into the eternal fire.
Wow. Now, Ron, some people struggle with this whole thing, and maybe we should... let's get to the last question, and I want to kind of wrap up a couple of thoughts on this. But the last question we want him to focus on, go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, so he tells us these stories, and he says there's something you should do. I like that. I like it when Jesus tells me what to do. You'll find these answers in verse 24, chapter 24, 44, and 25, 13. So look at those and get to what does Jesus tell us to do.
Okay, Ron, Jesus gives us some very specific things, right? What's he tell us to do?
Well, he tells us to be ready.
Be ready.
Just be ready.
Those are good words.
And
how do you get ready? We last week we kind of talked about it, which is discovering the righteousness of God and having that in our life.
Yeah, and I think there's other elements to it, that the life of people who are ready looks like servants who invest. It looks like people who take care of the poor and visit the sick. He's not saying those are the things that made them ready. It's what their lives look like. But they were ready. And I think I can't get away from the fact that all of these pictures illustrate there's a moment when it will be too late.
Yeah.
And we struggle with that. It seems unfair. But maybe we just don't know enough to make that call.
You know, when I look at this, Ron, I think people that struggle with that about God, I mean, ultimately, all of us deserve hell. There's
Sure.
not a single one of us. And he could have left everybody there, but instead he made a way for all of us to not have hell.
Mm-hmm.
And he leaves it in our hands, and he tells us, get ready. And I'm convinced of this. I've been around long enough to see God at work, even in the most hardened heart. When they come to their moment in life, their reckoning, their day of reckoning as it comes close, it seems as if God is at work in their hearts. And I've seen the most hardened hearts soften in moments where it seems like God's giving them an opportunity to choose him.
Yeah.
And I see that happening time and time again. And that's the information we don't see, which makes us look and say, oh, that seems unfair. But we don't know how God's at work in every one of our lives. But we do know this, that we need to make sure we're ready. And that's the only thing we can do, right? That's what we have to do together. Well, hopefully you've discovered that in your life, and a good chance for you to share and pray together. And before we leave today, let me just remind you that next week is our Listen to the Music Sunday, which means you get to have a party.
Yeah.
We're not going to have a Bible study for you. This is a chance for you to get some friends together, have a great time. This is a part of the social, the connecting that's a little different. And then come on that Sunday and have a great time, listen to the music. It'll be a great service. And then we'll start a whole nother series. It will be the last one before the summer. And we'll see you again at Connection Point Studies. We'll see you next time.